Hello and welcome to this AlbaCon 2020 interview video. I am Mark Palmer, one of the organisers of AlbaCon, which is an online charity role-playing convention. The convention is being held on the 3rd and 4th of October 2020, with all money going to It's Good to Give, who provide amazing support to young cancer patients and their families. Find out more at www.albacon.co.uk. Today we are talking about designing a dungeon, and I am joined by these awesome people. I'm joined by Daniel Bishop, Joshua Parry, Matt Whitby, and Stephen Hart. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourself, and I'm actually going to ask you as well, what is your favourite dungeon of all time? So if I start with you, Daniel.
I'm Daniel Bishop. I do some writing for Dungeon Crawl Classics, which is the best game of all time. Other people can disagree on the panel. However, going back to the dungeon of all time, I would have to say probably the Caves of Chaos in the Keep of the Borderlands.
Oh yeah,
or the Keep on the Borderlands is still something that keeps strong. Used in almost every edition of the game I played.
I think that was the first dungeon module I ever owned, actually, and I still have the copy that I got back in 1982 or whatever. So that's an excellent choice. Josh.
Oh yeah, I'm Josh, sometimes in some places better known as JVC Parry. My favourite dungeon, not of my own creation, is Iron Slag from Storm King's Thunder. And I think my favourite dungeon of my own design is probably Ascal from Call from the Deep.
Fantastic, thank you. Stephen?
Hi, I'm Stephen Hart. I run The Grinning Frog. We publish a range of system-free and D&D related supplements. In terms of favourite dungeon, I'm going to show it to you. I want to go classic and old school here. This is
nice one.
The Dungeon.
That would have been my number
from
two.
From the Holmes edition.
Basic edition. It's absolutely beautiful. It works. It's similar to it. It's really a template, I think, that we can all build on.
I'm not familiar with that edition actually, because I kind of came in the Moldvay era, BX. So I need to go and look that one up. I think I need to dig out a copy of that somewhere.
There's a new version actually on Drive-Thru, which someone has done an updated version plus the original content. So well worth a look.
And what's the name of the dungeon?
It never officially had a name. The name that's been given to it is Xenopus, because that's the wizard that you meet in it. That's his name. But it was never officially given a title, because this is back before they were so structured with their output.
Right, okay. Okay, thank you. And Matt, last but not least.
Hello, I'm Matthew Whitby. I'm I guess an author on the DMs Guild and host of the Dungeon Masters Guild House podcast. Favorite dungeon? Oh, that's a bit of a tough one, because I'm a hardcore 5th edition baby. But I really did enjoy reading through and playing Doomvault in Dead and Dead. The sort of complexity and sort of sprawling size of it all. It's just easy to get kind of lost in it.
Yeah, it's. Did you say Dead and Fade, didn't you?
Yeah.
It's an adventure I've never run, but one I'm very aware of, but I've just never run it. So I take it that's a Doomvault. Sounds like it's some kind of sizable piece of construction, is it?
Yeah. People can get lost, and and maybe that's the nature of it.
Okay. So I guess that kind of brings me on to my second question, which is, what even is a dungeon? What constitutes a dungeon? What makes Castle Ravenloft? Well, maybe you might consider Castle Ravenloft a dungeon, but where is that dividing line between a dungeon and just some kind of other structure with rooms and so on?
I think if I can take that one, I think principally it's underground. You have a limited amount of space. You have rooms that connect from one thing to another. It could be that it's a cavern-based dungeon. So you You could have a cavern opens out into another cavern, but still predominantly you are constrained by the fact that you are in the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't free roam, and you are led through a fairly linear sort of sequence of options, I would suggest. So for me, that's what I would think of as a dungeon versus some other kind of environment for an adventure.
Because I certainly, sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say, the idea of being not exactly trapped, but certainly constrained by a barrier of some sort it's got to be kind of an essential point, rather than, like you say, a free roaming experience. The key, I think, for me is that there's something with entrances and exits. Sometimes there's loads, sometimes there's only one, but that's a quintessential part, I think, of a dungeon.
And if it is not underground exactly, there is something that is effectively the same.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be that the dungeon is on another plane, and the outer plane stuff, it becomes the underground, but it acts the same way.
Yeah.
So,
I think,
so there's something that confines you then, is there? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, if you had underwater caverns, for example, it would be the same. Conceptually, it would be the same thing as a dungeon. Certainly from a designing perspective, it would be, because you are limited by this physical confine of what you find around you.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Matt, I cut you off there as well.
no, I was literally going to kind of build off what everyone else has said. That I think it's quite a surprisingly flexible definition. Like even though, like, again, as long as it sticks to the sort of core concept of, a location where people are making preparations to go into, you're going to face a sort of number of challenges. I keep it quite loose. So whereas, like, to take the Castle Ravenloft example, the dungeons underneath Castle Ravenloft, that's a dungeon. But you could also maybe consider the castle itself to be almost like a gazebo or just,
It's curious, because the next question I'm going to ask you is, where do you start with a dungeon when you're designing a dungeon? And I'm thinking, if I was designing a dungeon, I probably wouldn't start with a map as complex as Castle Ravenloft, which, if you've ever run Castle Ravenloft, you'll kind of know what I mean. But what is the starting point for a dungeon, for dungeon design? Is it the map? Is it the protagonist? Is it the plot hook? I really want to open that one to the floor, really, and see how you do it.
I definitely think for myself, it really varies as per adventure, because for me, at least, a dungeon has to support the narrative that's there. I don't really like adventures that are solely dungeon crawl with no great overarching story in there. So if the adventure narrative is about an event or a location, an environment, a particular kind of challenge, or a particular type of villain, then that really is what's going to be the focus for me, at least.
I guess the only build on that is, when I always start from, like, what is the purpose of this dungeon? Is it an actual business? Is it like to protect a powerful artifact? Is, like, it used to be like a sprawling underground city that has now been reclaimed? Work backwards from there, because then if kind of like someone had to physically create the dungeon, and if you can work for, like, okay, why was it created? You can kind of work backwards of, like, okay, well, logically it would have these types of rooms and this, at least personally.
Yeah, I think for myself, I tend point of interest for me. I've decided that the story has taken us underground. In my case, it's almost always underground. So what is it that's going to happen that's exciting? Is it going to be the room with all the portals to other dimensions? Great, then I'll start to design that, and I'll build out from there, going forwards and back. How do they get into the room? How do they leave the room? But I think if you start with, and I think we always have to remember with designing something for a role play game, that it's all about the story. It's all about people being excited when they play it. So let's take the thing that we find exciting, that inspired us in the first place, and try and create that. And then we can then build out in all dimensions and all directions from that starting point.
I'm personally all over the board with how I start. Sometimes it is a map. Sometimes it is a map that I have drawn. Sometimes it is a map somebody else has that I am then turning into an adventure. Sometimes it's an idea that idea or a storyline and you're trying to match. Sometimes it's just to try to get a particular experience. At some point, you want to have some particular thing happen or potentially happen in the game, and you're working towards making that occur.
Okay. And what about realism then? So we're talking there about starting with what the purpose of the dungeon was in the first place. Why was it built? What is everybody's stance on realism? So I very much grew up playing in the era of funhouse dungeons, and I'm not so sure that's quite as common a theme now in modern dungeon design. And there's always that joke of, has anybody seen the toilet in the dungeon? And there's never one on the map, right? And do these monsters just kind of sit around waiting to be slaughtered, or do they actually have lives? And so, what is your take on realism in dungeon design? Is it a necessary feature, or is there part of you that harkens back to that funhouse dungeon just because it's a bit wackier and sometimes easier to design, I guess?
I think for me, I'm a little bit OCD, and if there's a room that doesn't have a purpose, or if there's a room that isn't connecting well with the rest of the building, logically speaking, then I have to fix that. So I might have to add in a kitchen area. I might have to add in a cubby hole or an alcove where something's been sleeping, just because if it's in the room, and it's probably been in the room for a period of time, it's probably made itself comfortable. So that, I have to say, the realism helps me in some ways propel and build the dungeon. And I do actually have some dungeon maps I've done where I do have toilets indicated. I have to confess. I don't remember us ever going in there when it came to the adventure time, but they're on the map.
I have made use of toilets in dungeons as well. I mean, because they're going to exist. I think that you can have Gonzo elements in an adventure if you want, but there should be some kind of a thread that the players get a sense of actuality in the place that they're in. Like, if it feels disconnected for the players, and it's not going to be as much fun, even in the event of a funhouse type dungeon. If you go back to the early TSR ones, there usually is some kind of a thread of logic behind them.
Yeah, and I guess kind of to build off what Daniel mentioned earlier about the idea of, like, a dungeon existing within like a different plane. Those sort of settings kind of give you like a lot of freedom to play around with this sort of the funhouse side of the spectrum, just because you have essentially like a demigod or someone who has full control over a plane, and they could, if they wanted to, create a series of rooms that are pretty much like death traps or challenges. But to kind of hark back to like the idea of like, what's the purpose of the dungeon? I same with work. Even if it is like just a hole that then builds to like a smaller cavern beneath it, there's your toilet. And it's a throwaway line that you write in the description saying this cavern has been used as So yeah, no, I think it does. At the end of the day, it's like the as players kind of guide through, go through like mansions and houses, or the dungeons themselves. I think there always is that sort of question in the back of the mind of like, okay, well, is this logically laid out, or and then just by players thinking logically, when they have the sort of aha moments of, okay, well, if I go this way, there should be maybe this, or that kind of rewards them for like both you as a designer and the players for both thinking on the same wavelength.
Yeah, I think that for me, I care, I think, less about realism. The only time that I get really concerned or interested in including a state of affairs is like Matt said, when the players will in some way be rewarded for, putting two and two together, realizing, oh, there are people here, so there must be a kitchen, and maybe that kitchen has a chimney and we can get out of here, or something like that. Otherwise, for me, it really depends on the mood that I'm trying to set. I think if I'm playing a high fantasy kind of a game that's high magic, I'm not really good at mundane kind of rooms that you'll find, like empty antechambers or kitchens, toilets, whatever, that kind of thing. For me, I would only really include if it was more of a kind of classic OSR type game, or maybe even a grittier sort of proper dungeon crawling type game. I think a lot of the time when something's a bit wacky, I think you kind of just got to roll with the punches and get with it. Like I don't really see the purpose of including rooms that offer nothing to the play, essentially. And I kind of find that sometimes if you've got rooms whose sole purpose is just to enhance the nature of the dungeon, that can sometimes at the table just add time onto a game that might make it drag a little more than it needs to.
I have to admit, I recently ran White Plume Mountain, and one of the things that occurred to me is if you were a den, I mean, it all feels, I mean, it feels kind of wacky and funhousey as the players, but if you think that there are occupants of that dungeon who are kind of moving about from one room to the other, presumably avoiding giant crabs and gaseous bubbles and slippery rooms with razor blades and so on, I thought how impractical that kind of existence must be. So
yeah, I ran that.
A vampire
recently,
can fly.
so.
Yeah, it's an unusual one, isn't it? Yeah, but it's a great adventure, but none of it makes any sense, which is fine.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time it's about the story and it's about your group as well, because there are some groups out there who just won't care. You know, there are some groups who might feel like, well, hang on, there's living people in here. How are they getting across this floor of razor blades to get out and find food? There are other groups I think that really just want a challenge. Do you know what I mean? And you've got to keep challenging them with thing after thing after thing. And if you give them an empty room, they'll hunker down and rest in it. And then you've got a realistic kitchen in there, but you've also kind of taken away some of that element of challenge by giving them an opportunity to have a break.
To rest.
But I would counter that and say that I think one of the things you can use an empty room for is to break up, because if you have constantly challenge, there's no pause, there's no quiet spell. And I wouldn't be necessarily making the kitchen a safe place. That might be a very unsafe place to rest. For one thing, if it's the kitchen, it's a high traffic area, so you're likely to run into more people rather than less. But in all seriousness, I think that they can be very useful for altering the tempo of the adventure, making sure that the high points are high. And I also personally find it makes designing the layout an awful lot easier. You know, I've never built a dungeon in the dirt. So actually what room follows on from the one that contains the ancient portal? Well, frankly, I don't know. But if I can house it inside a mining complex, actually, I've probably got a better logical concept of how that might work.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was going to say, to kind of build on that, is like even like the concept of like including, if sticking with the kitchen example, I mean, that is a opportunity to create a unique encounter, like to take, what would a goblin chef be like? You know, and you kind of create a sort of more evocative or exciting encounter just by thinking about like, okay, well, you know, there would be a creature of some sort whose job it is to create food for everyone else. What sort of, you know, character or encounter would that be?
And what do they eat?
Well, yeah, exactly. You know, a kitchen itself could be very deadly if, you know, the creatures involved are eating nothing but, like, I don't know. My mind went straight to salamanders, the flaming ones, which I don't know if they would make a good snack or not. But yeah, it all kind of stems from there.
You've led. Sorry, carry on, Josh.
Also, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Josh.
Oh, sorry. I think an interesting thing as well, like we're talking about areas with different levels of traffic, is that in a few of the more recent 5th edition releases, they've included like roster tables of where monsters are and what their response to intruders is, for example. And I think those can be a really good way of tying in some level of realism where, you know, monsters aren't just hanging around to stumble upon them. If the alarm's raised, they're going to change their tactics. They're going to move to certain areas. They're probably not going to hang about in the kitchen. You know, they're going to head towards the battlements or wherever it happens to be.
But that was going to be my next question, which was, how do we prevent? How do you prevent the monsters really just becoming static cannon fodder? Because there's a real temptation to do that. Because certainly as a DM, it's easier than having to work out where all these creatures are going and what they're doing. But how do you incorporate that into your dungeon design?
Yeah, for me, roster tables is a big one where you've got a fair breakdown of at least the most important monsters in there, what their responses to intruders would be, or what they would be doing without anyone there. I think another way is just to kind of not exactly, basically to kind of mimic that, and rather than having something that the DM needs to consult if intruders occur, then you can just have a sort of the wandering monster type table where it almost creates the illusion of movement between rooms. Maybe actually there's not in reality.
You'd also get some of that illusion of movement between the rooms simply by having some of the rooms not be occupied.
Mhm.
I mean, when you're talking about an occupied kitchen, there is a certain amount of tension in going from room to room, knowing that the hammer is going to fall sooner or later and wondering where that is. So as players go from room to room and they're not occupied, that can help. It also sometimes helps if they backtrack and the room is now occupied.
Yeah, and I think similarly to them, your players do run into some creatures, even if they've already been, if you've written the dungeon so that when they go into room A, there is a creature. That creature doesn't necessarily need to be sitting there, you know, weapon drawn type of thing. Have the players walk into the room and then have the creature walk in through the other door. You know, create a sense of motion by having the actual creature move, which also creates opportunities for detections, you know, and hopefully sharpens up the players in terms of observing and looking around their environments a bit more.
Yeah, because I must admit, one of the things that like sometimes comes difficult to when it carry out like writing sort of a whole dungeon is that sort of like without having like a patrol table or anything like that, of like, okay, well, in the event of intruders, where do these people go, and how do you display that for the DM in the most efficient way, that they're not having to go, okay, well, they would have gone from, you know, room 7 to room 13, and it again, it can, especially if you want to have this sort of like whole atmosphere of like a living room, it can very quickly bloat in some way. So again, everyone's kind of suggested some amazing techniques to kind of ease the process as a designer to sort of make it both easy for the DM and for you when it comes to writing.
So we've probably all designed those dungeons that, you know, start with a corridor and there's a T-junction and there's a room at either end and something fairly traditional, you know, wooden doors, stone walls. How do we make that more? How do we vary that, make that more enticing? I can think of maybe the one that comes to mind for me is, you mentioned the Caves of Chaos, Daniel, which is just, you know, that to me was probably revolutionary at the time. I didn't appreciate it because I was like 11 years old, but it was probably revolutionary at the time in that you had multiple different entrances to the dungeon, which was kind of really, really unusual. And I think of Sailors of the Starless Sea by Harley Stroh, which, you know, there's just an internal ocean inside the dungeon, which is kind of really radical. But I'm looking to get an idea from you guys as dungeon designers. Is what do you do to crank it up a notch, to just put a twist on it?
I think what Stephen said earlier about having a feature in mind when you begin to design a dungeon can be a really important element of that. Because even if you are going to go down the traditional dungeon, like you say, kind of stone walls, underground.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
No, but if you've got something in mind from the beginning, like, you know, like an entire ocean under there, or in the example of Iron Slag, like a foundry where they're building a gigantic kind of automaton, that kind of thing can give you an idea of what to build around it, like we mentioned earlier, but also kind of the flow through the dungeon. You can offer like hints as to what's coming up. And I think that is a lot of time what makes a dungeon interesting, is to keep the players guessing about what's around the next corner and what they can anticipate, both in terms of, you know, monsters, traps, challenges, anything like that. And I think this having a central feature or a central theme can often help with that.
I think also it can come down to something as simple as a bit of dungeon dressing. So yes, you come to your plain wooden door, but don't have it be plain. Let's have it have some graffiti on it. Let's have it be inscribed with something. Let's have a fancy animated door sort of piece that asks for the password. It doesn't even have to be magical necessarily. It can just be ornate. Very small details can make a big difference. And I have to say, I found graffiti seems to really excite the players, because they seem to always assume there's some hidden message in the scroll on the wall, when of course that's not necessarily the case. But it's a very, very small and simple way of, you know, including some flavor. And as Josh says, you could have it foreshadowing what they're going to come to next. They could have, you know, some expletives about the mine worker or the factory owner, and you know, you then later on find out that they're a pleasant individual, and they've had that hinted at beforehand. I also like notes and journal entries. I like people to be able to find these little scraps of paper from either previous adventurers or previous occupants, possibly even prior to this existence of the dungeon, so that there's a deeper history to the location. And I think if you can create that deeper history, it just adds more flavor to the environment that they're in.
I would say also, in terms of features for dungeons, water is almost always worthwhile. I mean, even if it's just a stream crossing the path, and any kind of three-dimensional feature where it is not a flat room is worth your while. If there is a entrance that appears on a balcony and you're moving down, or it goes between levels or anything like that, it is always worth a player's interest. It's never the expected thing. In caves, that can include cliffs and drops that they have to negotiate with if they have it. And most players do.
Like vertical chambers as a whole work really well, especially when you start throwing in like flying enemies, just because unless the player are kind of equipped to deal with it. Or on the opposite end, just pits. Like just having like deep holes that, you know, immediately make combat that much more tense, just by knowing that there's, you know, a hole that for immediately players don't know where it goes. But then actually what I wanted to add to that, like as Stephen kind of mentioned, is that it's nice, it's when it comes to like designing them, and it's nice to have sort of like secret entrances, secret tunnels, and everything, or you know, secrets that kind of like just make a dungeon a little bit more crunchy. But I guess my thing is, don't be afraid to make the secrets not that secret. In a way of like, because if the secret is so obtuse that only the DM ever knows about them, it's not a good secret. Secrets, they're there to be discovered, and you know, small things like, was it a standard looking corridor where one side of the corridor has like a weird arm. Think things to that extent that can immediately allow the players to, as they sort of play through, just, you know, use their logic and find these exciting secrets that then again naturally guide the path kind of onwards.
I think that's an interesting point now. But I'll come back to the guiding the path thing, because I'll let Daniel speak first. But it's one of the things I was going to ask about guiding the adventures in a certain direction. Sorry, carry on, Daniel.
Pits. Since Matt brought it up, they don't always have to be just a hole in the ground either. For example, when I wrote Stars in the Darkness, the pits, all of the chasms in that adventure actually give way directly to outer space. If you fall into the pit, the odds are very good that you are lost forever, and there's even a chance that somebody will see your body drifting by when they get to another pit.
And therein lies the difference between DCC dungeon design and 5th edition dungeon design,
I suppose.
I think probably another member in terms of, you know, adding hints of fascination and stuff like that is combat is often the most kind of drilled in part of a dungeon, but it's really important to remember that, you know, there's three, at least in the 5th edition kind of terminology, there's three pillars of play, right? The combat, role play, and exploration. And I think it's really important to try and include those things as often and wherever possible. And, you know, if you can involve those, you know, have a bit of combat with something social going on in there as well, that's going to make it, you know, even better.
I mean, by its very definition, a dungeon is the number of choices are limited to the players, because they can only try, you know, obviously they're hemmed in by walls or whatever you're using in place of walls. How do you make sure that you design your dungeon so even if it's only an illusion of player agency, how do you kind of make sure that they feel like that they're actually steering the story rather than, you know, the walls and the corridors driving them to essentially to the climax of the adventure.
I'd like to be a bit controversial here and actually say that I think it's perfectly fine if they don't have choices, if you actually drive them in a linear fashion. It's one of the reasons that you might well build a dungeon adventure, is because you do want them to go from A to Z. Now, you might give them a couple of branching options, and I like to have the corridor goes down, it splits, they've got some choices, and then it comes back to point, if you will, geographically speaking. As long as the story moves, as long as there's interest in the characters and there's interesting environments and interesting combat and exploration opportunities, I don't see any problem, and I've never had a problem with any groups finding it like they're being herded. I don't see any problem in actually having a linear setup if you're building a dungeon adventure.
Okay.
And I would say that it makes it much easier for a new dungeon master to role play. Because when you create, the more of a sandpit you create, or the more of a matrix you create, the harder it is to have it ready for when they get to that new point.
Yeah, it's interesting because I recently ran Lost Mine of Phandelver for my son and some of his friends, and I think that there's a real danger with that as an introductory adventure, that you could suddenly just bypass that goblin cave at the start and go straight to Phandalin, and all of a sudden the new DM is faced with this massive sandbox. But the Goblin's Cave is a classic example of a kind of linear dungeon where it essentially goes in one direction. And it's a really great, and it uses a lot of the things that Daniel mentioned as well, the different elevations in the dungeon design. I think the whole of Lost Mine of Phandelver has lots of different dungeons with kind of different elevations and really kind of little nice geographical features. Yeah, I think I've actually lost the thread of what I was trying to say there, but
well, I think you were agreeing with me, which is great.
I was agreeing with you. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's what I was doing. Yeah, I think
it's true. I think they've for people like us, we sit around and we sort of conceptualize how great it is to have this sandpit or matrix. Actually, on a practical level, at the gaming table, A following B following C with maybe an option to do D or E can actually be a really good fun session, as long as the contents of that environment are fluid. So one aspect has to be, if you have a static environment and a static content, then you have a problem. But as long as the contents can morph and change based on player agency, fine to have a limited sequence of stages to get through the physical environment.
Yeah, I have to agree there as well. I think in terms of player agency, actually having just different routes through the same space is a relatively weak form of player agency. It's only if those different routes cause a difference in play that they're actually going to be worthwhile. So if one way is going to give them access to something entirely different than the other, then that's powerful player agency. But if you're just, seeing room A instead of room B, it's not quite the same. And I think you're right about the content. At least myself, I'd much rather as a player have a choice between, I don't know, using a flaming barrel as cover or using, a balcony as cover in one room than I would picking left or right at the end of a corridor.
I would like to disagree just for a second, not with the idea that meaningful choices within any encounter are important or the content's important, but I would not use A to B to C unless the actual point was to make the players feel like their characters were being herded, basically. And that's perfectly fine because your villain or your monsters or other creatures, parts of the world in real life and in the game, herd you in areas where they want you to go. But the players, generally speaking, in my experience, know that they're being herded, and that can be used for tension, but it's not what I would do for most dungeons.
I guess I sit in the middle ground. I was like, I'm stuck on the fence here. Because I think at the end of the day, I mean, the players are the ones the players are the ones driving the action, and obviously, as long as the players still have the urge or the sort of the desire to sort of keep exploring or to open that to kick open one more door. I think the order of the rooms. Again, they can be nebulous, and again, the DM is at any point free to sort of completely take any design dungeon and just sort of, you know, swoop around things to keep the flow of progress going. So yeah, so I guess I'm on the mindset that, you know, it's as long as you keep the incentive there for like the player. So why are the players kicking through doors, and as long as they've got something that they want to do. Occasionally offering like the sort of optional branch, like, I don't know, like the A or B option. Yeah, I don't know if I've actually added anything of value.
No, I think you have. I think,
there,
yeah.
It's important to realize that in these games, a fork in the road is never just a fork in the road. If there's an A or a B option, the players have means to determine which way they want to go. Even if you haven't written it into the dungeon, it's written into the game. In DCC, for example, the cleric could have the second sight spell, or the wizard might try to detect magic to see if there's something down that. They could look for tracks. There's all, they can get an idea what's where. It's not a meaningless choice. And preferably, if the rooms themselves are well written, which way you go actually makes a difference too. I don't know. When I'm writing a dungeon, I'm hoping that when I run it, it doesn't play the same for any two groups, that I will be surprised in the play of it as well as the players.
Okay.
Sorry, is it right if I jump in and ask a question then, Daniel? Sorry,
yeah, sure.
So what are like some of the techniques that you kind of use to like, is it just a wide selection of those sort of choices? Like, well, how do you encourage replayability?
Okay. You can encourage, first off, like if you're talking about the same group you're playing, or are you talking about different groups you're playing?
I mean, both are interesting. I don't know, which would you prefer to answer?
There are two different things. If it's different groups, then the order of the encounters actually can make a difference to how the encounter occurs, so that the players may or may not have information that they need when they hit the big combat encounter. They may or may not have information they need when they're talking to somebody. I'll be doing the Imperishable Sorcerers, I believe, on Sunday. And that is an example of a dungeon where there is a straight line through it. But if you take that straight line, you miss out on a lot of information that you could have. And whether or not you have that information makes a great difference to how the adventure ends. So for multiple groups, it doesn't always happen the same way. And themselves are designed to offer choices to the players. Do I want to try to become immortal? What are the consequences of that? Do I want to help this person become immortal? Have I even figured out that this is what's happening? If you're looking at an area for replayability, then you need to be able to have an area that cannot be explored in a single session at the very least. Take something like Barrow Maze by Greg Gillespie. There's no way that a party can explore that in a single session. Probably you're not going to explore the entire thing in a single campaign. In most people's campaigns, it becomes something where you might dip in or dip out for specific reasons. But the idea that there's something much larger is part of the goal of it. Or it could be a persistent location that you have to go to for multiple times for multiple reasons, and your reasons have changed, which changes how you interact with the area. When I did the CE series, there's one area, for example, that has a potential patron in it that the players would almost necessarily go back to just to get more information. I have another adventure where you can smear your own blood on these stone heads and they will answer questions for you. And then they tell you the secret of the last person who did it. Oh, you know that somebody's going to come along and get a secret of yours after you've done it. There's stuff like that.
Yeah, no, thank you very much.
So we'll move on to my favourite subject, because I grew up with these amazing tomes of Grimtooth's Book of Traps.
Sorry.
A few of you have probably encountered them. What about traps and to a lesser extent puzzles? I'm not as keen on puzzles. I think they're still important, but I'm saying to a lesser extent because I'm much more fond of traps. But what about traps and puzzles? Is it a thing that when you design a dungeon, you should have a trap and puzzle, or multiple traps and puzzles, or can we have a dungeon without traps and puzzles? Yeah, just open that.
Certainly have a dungeon. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Mark.
No, it's good. It's good.
You can certainly have a dungeon without those things, but it adds variety, and that's the best part of it. But it has to follow logically. There has to be, to my mind at least, there has to make sense that there is a pit trap or there is a magical exploding door trap. So who's built that? Who's had the time to build that? Dependent on the scenario. So I think there's three things you can look at. You can look at traps, you can look at challenges, you can look at puzzles, or you can look at challenges. And I think for me, I try and focus on challenges. So how can I challenge the players in a different way? That might be a mechanical trap, it might be a magical barrier, it might be a physical, pit or a cliff that they have to climb. So I think you need to put those elements in, but I don't think you need to be restricted to think, I have to have a trap, I have to have a pit, I have to have bolts flying out of a lock when it opens. That's too narrow. It's a case of, have I put them through their paces? Am I challenging the party in different ways in each of the sections of the dungeon? If I'm doing that, then it doesn't really matter how I'm doing it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I'd also add on to that if you can find a way of weaving those decisions into the story as well, either by your choice of inhabitants or that kind of thing, that is kind of bonus points really when you're designing.
I tend to agree, and I would add that when you are putting in traps, they should be predictable without just a roll. Overall, like the villain's bedroom, the door to it might have a trap. That is a logical place for a trap to be. If there is that razor blade floor and that's a high traffic area, there has to be a way to get around it. Sorry. And that way to get around it should also be detectable.
I agree. And I think, sorry, one other thing, I'm very much not in favor of instant kill. And I think it was a design flaw that we saw a lot of in the early years of Dungeons and Dragons in particular, where you pull on the wrong rope and you're dead. That we've moved past that, I hope. I think we should have things that are more clever. Although maybe Daniel's doing the opposite.
I would actually pretty much agree. Instant kill traps, unless it is a trap that it is so obvious that the players have a chance to figure out that it is an instant kill trap before they use it. And especially if it is an instant kill trap that they can figure out and then use against an opponent.
Yeah, I think instant kill traps in the Dungeon Crawl Classics context they're not so much instant kill as if you're running a funnel adventure, the trap may do enough damage to drop a character.
In a funnel you can run instant kill all you want. I mean, a funnel adventure, if the rest of you haven't played DCC, it's a 0-level adventure. Every player is starting with a handful of peasants, 4 when I'm running it, sometimes 3. And the survivors are your level 1 characters. So their basic background story becomes, I went into this area to deal with this thing and I watched all of my friends die. So the more amusing you can make the death, and the more, I say amusing, sometimes it's pretty grim. Our Witch Grinder is a 0-level Craftian, for example. It's amusing for me. I think it's amusing for people after the game, like when they're telling the story or whatever, but yeah, you can instant kill in a 0-level funnel, no problem. You just can't instant kill everybody. And actually, hold on, since we're talking DCC for a second, you could have an adventure with a trap that instant killed everybody if the next part of the adventure was then them waking up in hell and having to fight their way out.
Okay. That's
I think there's definitely clever ways that you can get around the concept of what like an instant kill trap is. But no, I can only echo the sentiments that like it can't be too surprising. It can't come out of nowhere unless the players have actually done everything in their power to avoid the red flags and sort of bright lights saying, that's coming here.
And especially if the red flags can be obvious enough that but subtle enough that they have to use their brains to catch them, then from a player standpoint, you can feel awfully good that you caught and figured out what would have happened to you.
So they've been through all these traps, and they've been through these they've fought the goblin chef or whatever. When you're designing, we talked about empty rooms earlier, and Sanctuary kind of in the kitchen, I think was the example we used. This might differ between the DCC model of design and the 5th edition model of design, but what's the take on giving players spaces within dungeons to be able to kind of recuperate, or find resources that can help them recuperate, like maybe potions or whatever? Do you feel that there's a need to build that in, or does that depend on the size of the dungeon, or what's the influencing factor in that?
At least in my opinion, I think it's good to sort of sometimes facilitate those options, but it should never be a free choice. It should be a risk to set up home in someone else's house and just expect to get 8 hours sleep is ambitious. And that's and that's why obviously the idea of like finding healing potions, it's a case of like, okay, well, whose healing potions were they before? And is it the case of like have the players successfully encountered a situation and then essentially looting? That's kind of how I play it. Is obviously, especially with as Josh kind of mentioned about the idea of like patrolling tables. There should always be like an added risk, unless they've cleared out the entire dungeon, everyone. Then I don't know if they would still sleep soundly. But that's.
I mean, I actually, when I write mine, I've on a number of occasions created large zones, or in fact entire dungeons, where you couldn't regain health from resting. You couldn't regain your powers because it was set up so that you couldn't. There was a magical barrier preventing that. And even there, I'm usually pretty hardcore, and I mostly play 4th edition actually. So I actually prevent my players getting their daily powers back unless they're back in safety, in proper safety. If they're underground somewhere, I'm sorry, but that doesn't count. You are not resting. You are not 100% asleep and being rejuvenated when you wake up. You're on alert. You're sleeping in your armor. It's not that good. So I'm quite, I don't believe in sanctuaries. I think if you're going to go down into the dungeon, you're going to go through the adventure. Yes, they can find some resources, but if you then strip away to regain quite as much health from resting, then those resources that they find become much more valuable to them, and they will go after them as much as they'll go after the rest of the storyline.
I think there's a big element in 5th edition of the ease with which characters can create their own sanctuaries, right? At quite early levels, they get access to spells that can essentially kind of get trouble pretty easily. So I think you do have to be careful in terms of how frequently you're providing them with the opportunity to use those spells, like you were saying. I think another important thing to think about is how long are they going to be spending down in this dungeon, right? If it's the sort of dungeon you can clear out in a single session, well then of course it doesn't even really make any sense to provide any opportunity for them to rest. But if it's the sort of mega dungeon where they're going to be down there 10 sessions or more, then at that point, I feel like you kind of have got to introduce ways in which they can recover their abilities, their hit points, in order to make it not for grind. But obviously that's quite a niche form of dungeon within the broader category. There's quite a good article, I think, by Sly Flourish about upbeats and downbeats, and about how it can change the narrative of the story you're telling. And obviously one obvious upbeat is to provide an opportunity for healing. And I think you've got to be quite conscientious when you're designing the dungeon about the order in which people are like upbeats and downbeats.
I think that there are times, if it makes sense in a dungeon, that the players might actually find people that have a civilization where they can actually find an inn or something equivalent. Not all the time, obviously. It'd have to be a very large dungeon before you're looking at like major cavern complexes or something. But the outer part of a dungeon is not always the same as the inner part of the dungeon. In Belmorphos, there is a bit where you get past the outer things, become the guest of a creature who's not good, but it gives you the opportunity to figure out your next steps and then move on to the next phase. In other places, if you were in Imperishable Sorceress, it's very cold, but there are not a lot of wandering creatures outside of the main hallway. If you are going through something like Joseph Goodman's People Find a Place to Rest and Hide, very good luck to you, because the odds are very good that cultists are going to grab you and sacrifice you before you hit that 8 hours sleep, right?
I think you've touched on something there as well that it's really important. It's like motives, monster motives, right?
Yes.
Because you might be in a goblin cave, but if there's a goblin in there and all he cares about is money, well, maybe he'll watch you while you sleep, or you can get any
if
number
you trust
of,
him, yes.
Oh, sure, yeah. But you can come up with any number of kind of conceivable motive might allow the players to get that rest if that's the kind of thing you need. And you can even write that into the dungeon when you're designing it. You could say, if the players are having a really hard time, well, here's an option to give them a bit of a break if they really need it. And conversely, if they're really absolutely acing this dungeon, well, yeah, this goblin's going to watch them sleep and then steal their stuff before they wake up.
I think sorry.
No, go ahead.
That's why I personally really love the idea of multi-faction dungeons, or just like dungeons where there are like almost like warring factions that sort of and then the interplay between them kind of allows the players to sort of hit those three pillars, because as you're exploring through the dungeon, you're learning the relationship between these factions that you can slowly begin to sort of play to your favor. And then that kind of lends itself to like, well, if the players can negotiate, a safe space, or, somewhere where they can sort of rest the thing, then that's them being rewarded for, doing very well in the role-playing tier.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. It goes back to a question Mark asked us all earlier about how do you add variety. And I think one of the simplest methods is you have a third faction. So there's always somebody else down there. Could be a single person who's traveling through. It could be a group of people. It could be another enemy faction who's enemy of thy enemy, and so on. But you have a third party who more neutral perhaps than the normal inhabitants, and that then creates these options for help and healing, or information, or plot advancement, and so on.
I think a really easy way in which you can introduce that kind of thing as well is to consider who designed the dungeon and then who actually made it, right? And those two groups are likely to be separate, and there can always be an interplay there, I think.
I was saying, as like a surface level fun one is like, if you want to like add at least some level of interplay, just throw in like a rival adventuring party who are trying to, who maybe they go, if you go left, they go right, and it's the case of like, okay, always in the back of your mind of like, to the big bad, evil boss before we do. It's like a race against time.
It's amazing how rarely you encounter a rival adventuring party in a dungeon. Even a mega dungeon, it always seems to be quite a rare thing, doesn't it? I guess it's difficult to run for a dungeon master.
Well, it was more common in the old days when you would have multiple parties running under the same dungeon master,
right? Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Okay, I'll move on. I'm conscious of time. I'll move on, and one of the things I wanted to talk about is, and it's probably something that's even more critical in these COVID-affected times when we're all playing online. I want to talk about maps. Where do you start with a map? Do we start with 5-foot squares, 10-foot squares? Is it something that's just drawn on scrap of paper, or is it a highly detailed thing along the lines of the Doug Kovacs maps, which are just works of art?
Yep.
What level of detail do we need in a map? I'm open. I just opened the floor in general about maps, and the other thing I had was, has the use of maps changed now that everyone's playing online? Because often there's a metagaming aspect to that as well, with with Fog of War and so on. They can tell when where things are on maps that they can't see, and so on. So just open the floor on maps in general, really.
I think if we're looking at from a designing a dungeon perspective, and I think that, you know, start off and keep the barriers of entry as low as possible. Post-it notes. Start off with scribbles that are put into a journal, and then you can build up from there. I think a lot of dungeon masters or would-be dungeon masters are put off by some of the fantastic maps that you can find online, and they think they have to create something as fantastic as Dice and Logos work, or any of the other great map makers. Actually, those post-it notes we build into something that's entirely usable at the game table. You roughly estimate, okay, the room is longer than it is wide. Great, I kind of know that then. Oh, look, there's a river down the side. I can hear the water. You know, you can keep it very simple, and if you keep it simple, you're more likely probably to actually finish the design work and finish that adventure. So I think start with a piece of paper. If you want to go on then to do it, you know, on the PC with, you know, Photoshop or whatever, then great, more power to you. But there's no need from an operational perspective, from a gaming perspective. A notebook with a hand-drawn map is perfectly fine.
I will go even one further. There are a lot of times when I'm trying to design something where I will start with a sheet of paper and I will draw circles on that sheet of paper. I will put A, B, C, or D, or however many for the important rooms, the things that I think that they have to hit, the choke points, if you would. And then I will start drawing connections between those lines to indicate, I don't even know what they're going to indicate yet. And I will try to include some ways to bypass those major things in some cases, but not in all. So that the adventure will be different as different players go through and interpret that pattern map into a real map.
I think it can be quite a difficult question, really, because as a designer, you have to cater for people who are going to use theatre of the mind and people who are going to have that battle map either printed out or loaded up on their screen. So, you know, it's quite difficult. I would say probably work with whatever feels natural to you to begin with. You can obviously do it without a map at all. I mean, you only have to look at kind of the Steve Jackson choose your own adventure type books to see, you know, we can go through a dungeon without a map with just a load of pages and descriptions. You could probably even condense that down to bullet points if you really needed. But then if you're the sort of person who is quite visual in terms of their design, well then, yeah, by all means, pull a map off, you know, the biggest map you can find off the internet and start looking for inspiration in those places.
I guess there's a difference between if you're running for your home group or if you're publishing on, say, you know, the DM's Guild, or you're publishing for, you know, DCC. I guess there's a difference in the level of fidelity of the
Else
map.
will then draw your map for you.
And yeah, I must admit, yeah, I don't really have much else to add. So I kind of like, for all my adventures, I kind of draw my own maps, and I kind of keep it to the 5 foot square scale, just in the case that, like, you know, there is a possibility that people may want to use it and like a virtual tabletop thing. And you know, I always do this sort of, you just boxes and stuff like that, and then you drill into detail, and then rather than having like a box line, you draw the lines of the cavern. It builds up from there, really.
Certainly in terms of publishing on DM's Guild, if I ever release a project that talks about an area and doesn't have it mapped out in 5 foot squares, I will receive comments saying, where's the map? So I think if you're going to publish, there's a lot of easy tools, stuff like Dungeon Scrawl, that can put together a map that's nice looking, but also really easy to create.
It also depends to some degree whether you're using a system that wants to have miniatures on the map, like it's more using theater of the mind. And DCC uses far more theater of the mind than, for example, 4th edition.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, I get what you're, and I know exactly what you're saying, Daniel. Is that I know I've not played 4th edition, but I played 13th Age, and there's not the reliance on kind of square by square movement, and there's a kind of general distances given for things. So yeah, theatre of the mind probably more, but I certainly know that things like games like Pathfinder and 5th edition, there's definitely a more tactical element, and the map is kind of really important.
I think I would recommend that if you're designing a dungeon, whether it's for yourself or for publication, that you certainly draft out something that you can use. It doesn't have to be squared off. An example, I have another one here. So this is quite roughly done. I did it in a lunchtime. But it's actually perfectly operational from a perspective of, I know the rough layout of the rooms. And I've got them labeled, so I know, okay, room 1 is this, room 2 is this. And it's to sit down, whether it's for publication or whether it's just for my own use. I've got a structure that I can hang it on. And I think mapping it does help clarify in your mind what you're putting the players through, because you can see the dead ends in your story. You can see where actually it's being too linear, and actually you could do with another option there. Or actually, where the heck did the bad guys come from? Because there's no entrance to that part of the dungeon. So, you facilitate that. It's a tactical tool, but it doesn't have to be fancy until you get to the point of publication. And then, Josh has said very clearly, and it's true, if you're going to put an adventure out there, people want maps. That's just a fact.
Yeah, and it goes to say too, like after I've done the circle map thing where I've made a pattern and something's got to be drawn that's better than that, because you need to be able to see the relationships between the things when you're looking at it. And sometimes players will have a path that you did not expect.
Yeah.
I was going to say, just as almost like a sneaky thing, when it comes to like your own sort of hand-drawn maps, even if you're not like the most just by drawing it out on the thing, you can take a picture of that and throw that on Photoshop and just make it look like it's a sort of like someone in the dungeon who's hand-drawn a map. And you could just use that naturally to sort of lend itself to like, if you are playing in Theatre of the Mind, just by having like, again, for the DM, just to be able to visualize the space, and for the players to potentially find, this sort of hand-drawn map. But at the very least, it gives you like a in-world excuse for a sort of, including your hand drawings.
Yeah, I have the strong impression that the rest of you are much better cartographers than I am.
In terms of, you're talking about cartographers there, who is the cartographer in your game? Is it the DM stroke judge stroke GM? As in, are you providing the map to the players? So whether you're revealing that on Roll20 or on the table or whatever, or are we talking old school where we expect someone to be the inverted commas mapper, and God forbid if they're not listening properly when you describe a room? Because I'm aware there are different views on that kind of approach to.
Well, my approach is based purely on practicality, because I mostly play 4th edition. Although I write for 5th edition and other game systems, I mostly play 4th, and I mostly do that with quite a hefty range of miniatures that I have and love all too much. But that means that there's maps on the table, so there's no way they've come from, and the players would just argue and say, well, we're just going to turn around and go back the way that we came in. And that's the level of sort of reality that we just contend with. So the map ahead isn't shown. That's revealed as they explore.
Yeah.
And I put dungeon tiles down or hand-drawn maps down on the table. But because of the miniature base, I've dispensed with the mapper, because it was a bit of a nonsense, quite honestly. Or it felt like it's to me and my groups.
Yeah, I think it's a special kind of game that has its own mapper. I think as soon as you bring in that sort of thing, I think it makes it grittier and a lot of times harder, because if they get the map wrong, all of a sudden you're working off different maps, right? And that introduces a level of complexity that probably most sessions could do without. Having said that, I think, for the right kind of feel of a game, I can see that it's got merit.
I think just the only thing I add is it being mostly a 5th edition baby again. When it comes to like combat, exactly where they are. And that's when using like a pre-drawn map kind of has its element, because you have the whole room. There's no confusion. You can sort of sort out distances. But yeah, as Josh said, it kind of depending on your party, your mileage may vary.
I ran an adventure last weekend actually, which is acting up in Lankmar, Dungeon Crawl Classics Lankmar adventure, and it's set in a theatre, and the players are defending a theatre, and it really jarred me because I revealed the map of the theatre to them in its entirety right from the start of the session, and I just realised that it's so rare to do something like that. I'm so used to them edging through the map and revealing areas as they go, and to say, here's this entire theatre, do what you like with it. It was quite an unusual approach. Okay,
I seldom provide a map, and in the games that I'm running, the players also seldom map. They do end up getting lost, and I have no problem with that.
Into the space hole they go.
I tend to try to give out magic items and things that allow players to ask questions, so that they have at least a limited number of yes/no questions and things like that during a given session. So as a result, if you get severely lost, you at least have some options for getting out, but it's a limited resource that you're using.
Okay. Okay, so I'm conscious of the time, so we'll wrap up there. But I'm going to wrap up with one. Before we go, I'm going to ask you to kind of give me one. If you had one designing a dungeon, one tip for designing a dungeon that you've not shared already, I guess, that you really want to just get across. Let's go around and see what that killer tip that you have is. Start with you, Daniel.
It's generally speaking, your first idea is a good idea. If you let it simmer till you have a second idea, especially if it opposes the first idea, the design will be better.
Josh. Josh, do you have
sorry, I missed that.
You were still on mute. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if I'm allowed, I'll be a bit cheeky and kind of give 1.5. My first would be there's a concept called the 5-room dungeon concept. I think it's by John Ford originally, or maybe not. That's where I heard of it.
I'm familiar with it anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of it too.
Give that a read, because that will give you a really good idea of just how to get something down on paper, especially when you're designing. And I think I would give is steal stuff. Do you know what I mean? Read what you like and change it a little bit, and then bring it into your own work.
And Matthew?
Oh, I was going to say, I had mine stolen. So I will go with a very cheap and cheerful one, is that players will be fronted with a closed door and lose their mind. So every now and then, just have the door slightly, give yourself a good amount of time on the table where they're not like, is it locked? Like, can I just have it slightly open already? And that's all you need.
And Stephen?
I think that one's great from Matthew. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do it next. The one I brought to the table, we've already talked about, which is having elevation and thinking in 3 dimensions when it comes to the layout of the dungeon. So the one I've sort of dredged up whilst other people were saying things was keep it simple. If you have a mirror on the wall that is in some way connected to, that's probably enough. That's going to make for a very interesting room. So you can do a lot, or rather the players can do a lot with very few things. Don't overload it. Core ideas, keep it simple, and they'll do the complex stuff.
Okay, great. I just want to thank all of you for taking part. There's been some great insight into designing a dungeon there. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope people watching it learn a lot. I just want to take this opportunity as well to remind everybody that AlbaCon will take place on the 3rd and 4th of October 2020. All the money will go to It's Good to Give, who provide amazing support for young cancer patients and their families. And you can find out more at albacon.co.uk. Thank you very much for your time. And it's very, very much appreciated. I hope to see, I know I'm see some of you at AlbaCon. So thank you and take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.